Hello everyone, it's a beautiful spring day here in Belfast, and we are embarking on our fourth episode of this season, Jim. The case for God is our theme this season. Our first three episodes were really just clearing away some of the initial questions, but in this episode we're going to consider the first really big argument for God's existence.
That's right. In the first episode we made the point that there is no single knockdown argument for the existence of God. But the cumulative case made by combining the big arguments is really, really strong. Then in the second episode, I tried to show that no one can take refuge in agnosticism because there are only 7 basic worldviews in the history of human thought, and we need to believe one of them.
In the third episode, we discussed the argument from reason. We discussed the origin of reason, because if we're going to embark on this journey that examines the case for God, we need to be confident that reason can deliver us the truth of the matter.
I made the point in that episode that for the theist, our rational faculties have been designed by a rational God. The God who designed physical reality is the God who gave us the cognitive faculties that we use to understand reality. The two fit together like a spanner and a bolt. But if naturalism and evolution are true, then we cannot be confident that our cognitive faculties can discern truth. Rationality is just another survival mechanism. So that episode should at least give the naturalist listening to us some pause for thought. But for the rest of the series, we're going to assume that we can be confident that logical reasoning can lead us to truth.
Now, Jim, I understand that you have a logical approach to your shopping strategy. So you apply logic in some way to your shopping. Our listeners, I think, would be intrigued to hear more about that approach.
With most unfortunate consequences, I'm afraid. I think I talked about this before. Since the pandemic, Ollie, I tend to buy my non-perishable goods in bulk. Okay. Now I'm not like one of those survivalists in the States, who store thousands of cans of baked beans in their nuclear fallout shelter. But there are some items that I only ever buy once every 6 months or so. And that, Ollie, includes coffee. I buy these gigantic tubs of Tesco Gold Blend instant coffee whenever they're on offer. I mean, I imagine that offends your sensibilities.
Well, the fact you're only doing that every 6 months concerns me, Jim, because obviously there's something up with that coffee if it's lasting for that amount of time and it's perfectly fine.
But it's freeze-dried.
That in itself is an issue for me, Jim, I have to be honest. Just on the point of you not being like a survivalist, have you ever considered building some sort of bunker in your garden before?
Oh, on many occasions.
I knew you would have done
On many occasions. But anyway, on Wednesday, I did an inventory check and I discovered that I was running low on some items. So I called in at my local Tesco store, and when I arrived at the checkout, my trolley was piled high with only 3 items. Okay. And to my horror, the man ahead of me in the queue introduced himself to me. He was a member of a lovely little church down the Ards Peninsula that I preach in occasionally. And he glanced at my shopping trolley and he saw 72 toilet rolls, 5 giant bottles of bleach, and 3 tubs of Gold Blend coffee and 1 Snickers bar. And it was obvious that the man had so many questions. But I was on the verge of making a joke of it being on the most savage diet ever devised. But we didn't really know each other well enough, for that tactic. So instead, we just engaged in this slightly stilted conversation, and the brilliant logic of my shopping strategy was left unexplained.
Wow. I really hope that man is listening to this episode. But yes, that is an extremely unusual approach to shopping, I might suggest, Jim. But it's very you, and I feel like our listeners will appreciate it. This is the second time, to be honest, so far this season, you've made me pivot kind of awkwardly from some unrelated topic to our theme for the episode. But let's do that now. In this conversation, we're going to tackle the first real argument for the existence of God. And it focuses on the origin of the universe. Its technical title is the Cosmological argument. It's a very old argument and can be traced back to the 11th century Muslim philosopher Al-Ghazali. The term Kalam comes from the philosophical school that Al-Ghazali worked within. But in recent times, the argument is most commonly associated with the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. Could you tell us how this argument works?
The Kalam is actually a really simple 3-step piece of logic. It states, firstly, if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause. Secondly, the universe did begin to exist. And thirdly, therefore, the universe has a cause.
As we'll see later on, all the action around this argument centers on premise 2. But let's start with the first premise, which states that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause.
There are very few atheists who dispute this first premise. I mean, it just seems so obviously and intuitively true. We don't live in a world where a large refrigerator would just materialize out of thin air beside us. Everything which has a beginning must have a cause. The idea that the universe could just somehow create itself, it's actually worse than magic. When a magician pulls a rabbit out of a hat, at least there's a magician on the scene. But something cannot come from nothing. If something could come out of nothing, then why just universes? Why not Bach or spaceships or Smeg fridges? Nothingness has no properties, so there is no way that it could discriminate and only allow entire universes to pop into existence. The entire scientific enterprise is based on the principle of cause and effect. So, if the universe could just pop into existence from nothingness, then all science becomes suspect.
So the first premise of the argument seems clear. If the universe began to exist, then it must have a cause. The really controversial step, though, is actually the second one, which states that the universe began to exist.
Yes. Now, there is only one escape tunnel for the atheist out of the Kalam argument, and that is to assert that the universe is eternal, that the physical world had no beginning, that it's always been here in some form. So because it never had a beginning, then it would not require a cause. Now, we're going to spend nearly all our time on this second premise. Does the universe have a beginning or not? And there are 4 big arguments in favour of the universe having a beginning. The first 2 are scientific arguments. So there we will look at empirical data and then we'll make an inference to the best explanation. And the second 2 are philosophical. So let's think about the first 2. The first scientific argument is based on the expansion of the universe. And the second scientific argument is based on the thermodynamic properties of the universe. I'm sure many people have heard of the second law of thermodynamics. And then, as I say, the other 2 arguments are philosophical. And the first one says that it is impossible to have an actual infinity in space-time. And the second one, it sounds similar, but it's a bit different. It says that an actual infinite cannot be formed by successive addition.
Okay, so some of that sounds pretty heavy, Jim. If I was listening to this, I would have paused at that point, probably jumped back 15 seconds, re-listened, perhaps written down those arguments. But could you maybe help us out a little bit with these?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the certainly for the first argument. So what we'll do is we will move quickly over the surface of the first argument, and then we'll go through the other 3. Okay, and then once we've done that survey, I'm going to show how powerful the Kalam argument is. Then those listeners who want to be sure that the first argument is sound can listen on while we get into the weeds of that argument. Okay, so let's start with the first scientific argument. Okay, the one about the expansion of the universe. Before the 1920s, physicists assumed that the universe was stationary and eternal. Okay, it had always been there, and it was unchanging. Then Einstein published his groundbreaking paper on general relativity. And to his own embarrassment, Einstein had to introduce a fudge factor into his equations to maintain this static universe. But then 2 other scientists, one was a Russian mathematician called Alexander Friedmann, and the other was a Belgian astronomer called Georges Lemaitre. He was actually a priest as well, but that's beside the point. Anyway, they removed this fudge factor from Einstein's field equations, and they solved them in a way that predicted that the universe had expanded and was expanding. And the scientific community was shaken to its core by this so-called Friedmann-Lemaitre model, because it gave the universe a history, okay? Rather than being this static, eternal thing, suddenly the universe had a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble, now famous because of the Hubble telescope, he demonstrated that redshift in the optical spectra of light from distant galaxies confirmed that these galaxies were moving away, okay? That they confirmed the predictions of the Friedmann-Lemaitre model. So Hubble's data confirmed what came to be known as the Big Bang. In other words, the universe had a beginning. Are you sticking with me here? Yes?
I think so. I'm still here. If only I had some gold blend to help me stay awake during this.
It's really difficult to explain how revolutionary this idea was. There's a physicist called John Wheeler, and he says, of all the great predictions that science has ever made over the centuries, was there ever one greater than this, to predict and to predict correctly, and predict against all expectation, a phenomenon so fantastic as the expansion of the universe? By the time we get to 1970, we have Stephen Hawking, yes, very famous, and Roger Penrose, and they affirmed what they called their singularity theorem, which concluded that, assuming general relativity governed all aspects of reality, the universe began with an initial singularity. Okay. Now, it was in that historical setting that William Lane Craig comes onto the stage. He published his defense of the Kalam cosmological argument, which is premised on the idea that the universe had a beginning. And over time, his arguments began to cut through, both in academic and popular circles, because he was using these latest results from science to defend the second premise of the Kalam. The universe had a beginning. Now, the philosophical arguments we'll think about in a moment, the philosophical arguments about the impossibility of an infinite regress into the past, that they had been discussed for centuries. But Craig's approach gained traction because science itself was positing an absolute origin from nothing. The so-called Hawking-Penrose theorem concluded that not only matter and energy came into existence, but space and time came into being at the singularity. So that's the thing you need to understand. It's not just that matter is expanding, it's that space itself is expanding. And the physicist Paul Davies reflected the mood within the scientific community. This was around about the 1980s, okay? And he said, most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all matter and energy in the universe, but also of space-time itself. And Craig's use of the Kalam had enormous persuasive power in a culture that valued, empirical evidence over philosophical argument. And for over a decade, Christian apologists felt as if they were on the front foot because science had just confirmed the majestic words of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
The argument from the expansion of the universe has become more complicated, though, since the early 1980s, because we have had the so-called multiverse theory come to be developed. And we're going to dive into that later on, aren't we? But for now, what can we say about the status of the argument that the universe had a beginning because it's expanding? Is that still a strong argument?
Well, in summary, yes, we can say that even if the multiverse theory is true, and that's an enormous if, it's such a speculative idea, but it still points to the universe having a beginning, and I'll explain why that's the case later on for those who are interested in the details. But let's move on to the second scientific argument for the universe having a beginning, and it's based on the thermodynamic properties of the universe. So the second law of thermodynamics states that a closed universe will always move to what's called increased entropy. In other words, energy inclines towards dissipation and disorder. Okay, so scientists now believe that the universe is moving inexorably towards cosmic death, right? A state of coldness, disintegration, and deadness. In the end, only a dilute gas of fundamental particles and radiation will remain, a sort of microwave soup. Now, here's the argument. If the universe had an infinite past, why has the cosmic death not occurred? Okay, do you get that logic? Think back to one of those old wind-up clocks. Our universe, like the clock, is still ticking along. So whoever wound the clock up in the first place couldn't have done it an infinitely long time ago, because otherwise the clock would have stopped. Okay,
that is doing strange things to my brain, but I think I'm with you still.
Right. One of the great strengths of the argument is that it applies to the multiverse scenario as well. So it's a really strong argument. There's a very famous quote in the world of physics from the early 20th century cosmologist, Sir Arthur Eddington, to give him his full title. And he said this. This is physics humor, by the way. He says, if someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. I think that's brilliant. Physics humor.
Sorry, Jim. That one's lost on me. In summary, though, Jim, we can say that science is still very much supportive of the idea that the universe had a beginning. So that's an encouragement for us. And you said that there are then these two philosophical arguments that also support the Kalam's second premise. Could you tell us a bit about those?
Okay, now I'm going to make your head melt here, right?
I'm already struggling a little bit.
These are not scientific arguments.
Okay.
This is just pure logic. Pure logic, okay? So we'll think again about this claim that the universe had a beginning. If that's not true, then time and space must stretch back into the infinite past, okay? So think of all the events that have occurred in the universe. They must stretch back to infinity, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first philosophical argument says that is logically impossible. Now, this, to my mind, is the third argument. This is the most powerful of them all. And it is this. Actual infinities cannot exist in space-time. Now, just let me quickly clarify a couple of things for any mathematicians listening. First, we all agree that potential infinities exist. So think of the set of even numbers, for example, okay? 2, 4, 6, 8, and so forth. That is a potential infinite. But that's not what we're talking about, an actual infinite. And the second clarification is, we can all agree that mathematicians use infinities in their models. I vaguely remember Cantorian maths from my university days. But those infinities only exist in the models, not in reality itself. Okay. So now let me try and prove to you why actual infinities cannot exist in the past. Okay. I'm using a thought experiment first invented by the German mathematician called David Hilbert. And he says, imagine a hotel. Okay. We'll call it the Hilbert Hotel. And it has an infinite number of rooms. Okay. So you arrive at this hotel one evening, you and Rachel, and you're told that the hotel is full. All the rooms are full. There's not a single vacancy throughout the entire infinite hotel. But don't worry, says the manager. What I'm going to do is this. He proceeds to move the person in room 1 into room 2, and the person in room 2 into room 3, and so on. And as a result of the changes, room 1 is now available, even though the hotel had been full before you arrived. Now, let's imagine that an infinitely long bus now arrives.
This is like a fever dream.
Yeah, an infinitely long bus full of guests. So an infinity of guests now stand in the lobby trying to get a room in an already full hotel. No problem, says the manager. He moves you out of room 1 into room 2, but then he moves the occupant of room 2 into room 4 and the occupant of room 3 into room 6. So what he's doing is he's doubling the room number, okay? So each time he moves a person into the room number that was twice his own. Now, since any number multiplied by itself is even, it must be definitely, by definition, all the guests have ended up in even-numbered rooms. And that means that the odd-numbered rooms are all empty. And so the infinity of guests currently standing in the lobby can all be accommodated in them. So even if an infinite number of infinitely long buses arrived unexpectedly, the manager could fit them all in. So the Hilbert Hotel scenario shows the sheer absurdity of trying to have an actual infinity in space-time. And think what that means. If we can't have an actual infinite number of events in the past, if that's impossible, then the universe must have a beginning, which means it must have a cause.
I think it's fair to say these arguments about actual infinities aren't easy to grasp. But yeah, I think I'm starting to get the idea that that an actual infinite cannot exist in the real world, because we can't have an infinite sequence of events stretching back into infinity. So the universe must, as a matter of logic, have had a beginning. Is basically what you're saying. Your final argument also has something to do with infinity, somewhat ominously. What is that?
I feel the dread in your voice. Right. The final argument isn't so much about the possibility of an actual infinite in the real world. It's about the impossibility of traversing such an infinite series. Now, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense to you, so let me give you an illustration, okay? Imagine a line of dominoes, right, on the table, falling down, okay? One domino at a time. Each domino represents some event in the past. And the domino that is just falling right now represents the present, okay? Mm-hmm. Bang. That was very dramatic.
That helps me, to be fair.
No. If the universe is really, really old, the line of dominoes would stretch back along Lower Crescent, I'm looking out the window here, down and eventually down the whole way to Dublin. So it would take a very, very long time before the dominoes on the table started to fall, before we got to the present, okay? But now imagine that the line of dominoes stretched away to infinity, out past the Milky Way, out to the edge of the universe, even beyond that. If it was truly infinite, then we could never, ever arrive at the present moment when a domino on this table got knocked over. So the basic idea is that if there is an infinite regress of past events, then we can never get to the present. Now, that is actually not a very good way to explain the argument, so I'm going to give you a better one in a second. But let me first state the argument formally. The series of past events in time is a collection formed by successive addition. Okay, so event E1 leads to event E2, which leads to event E3, and so forth. But a collection formed in this way, formed by successive addition, cannot be actually infinite. And here's my simple illustration. It's called the story of the backward counter. Okay, so imagine a man appears before us saying, -4, -3, -2, -1, I'm done, right? And informs us that he has just finished counting the negative numbers backward from an infinite past. Now let's suppose that our encounter with the backward counter occurred on a Saturday. But why did he not complete on the day before, on the Friday, or a week earlier, or 1,000,000 years ago? There's a philosopher called David Otterberg, and he argues that the backward counter illustration reveals the idea of an infinite past can have no explanation because of what I've just explained. Why now? Why not some other time? So let's imagine that the backward counter finishes at time t. But given the infinite amount of time that has already elapsed, he could equally well have finished at time t-1 or any time prior to t. So no matter what time he finishes, there simply could be no explanation for it. And he concludes with these words: there can be no explanation, no reason why the backwards counter finishes at any particular time. Yet if this sort of contingent fact needs no explanation, whatever does? His point is that the idea of an infinite past cannot be explained, so it's illogical. Now, I am acutely conscious, Ollie, that the last few minutes, while I have enjoyed them enormously, have been a tough listen. But let's just take a step back and see where we have got to. Because this is where you now see the power of the argument. We have two scientific arguments using inductive logic alone, along with empirical data, and scientists have given us very strong reasons for positing that the universe had a beginning. Then we looked at two philosophical arguments, and there we used deductive logic to prove that the universe must have a beginning. And those strange thought experiments about Hilbert's Hotel and the backwards counter prove that the universe must have a beginning.
If we go back to the beginning of this Kalam argument, we said first, if the universe had a beginning, then it must have a cause. Second, the universe had a beginning. And so third, the universe must have a cause. Why is that such a big deal in the context of the case for God?
Well, if our listeners have stuck with us through that morass of logic, I'm very grateful to them. But now we get to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Because the Kalam argument takes us much further than most people think. It proves that the universe must have a cause. But when we think about it, we actually learn a lot about the cause. The cause must be itself uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. It is therefore the uncaused first cause. Then secondly, it must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. So it must be immaterial and non-physical. And of course it must be unimaginably powerful, since it created all matter and energy. But we can go further, again using logic alone. Once we concede that the universe was caused by a timeless, immaterial entity, there are only two options available to us. There are only two types of thing which meet those criteria. Only two types of things that are timeless and immaterial. There's an abstract object, like the number 7, or there is an unembodied personal mind. Now that is an astonishing conclusion, because there is a feature of abstract objects which rules them out as a possible cause. Abstract objects cannot cause anything. They are causally inert. The number 10,000 is a nice number, but it cannot cause you to have £10,000 in your bank account. Abstract objects can't cause anything. So the cause of the universe must be an unembodied personal mind. So you see the power of that argument? When you follow its logic to the end, you're forced to conclude that the cause of the universe is an uncaused, immaterial, eternal, unimaginably powerful personal mind. This personal being is in a different category from all creation, which was brought into being from nothing but by personal agency.
Yeah, I mean, that is extremely powerful. Though I think it must be said that it doesn't necessarily take us all the way to the God of the Bible. We're still perhaps a bit of a way from that. But the Kalam argument has taken us a long way towards theism. At this stage, we know nothing about the personal being's nature. He or it may be nothing more than a vast intelligence with a will and lots of power. But it is really interesting that logic alone, using nothing but science and philosophy, has got us this far.
I think it's astonishing. But we're trying to be fairly rigorous in this series, Ollie. So I do want to dive into the weeds of the first argument about the expansion of the universe, about the Big Bang. A lot of Christians talk confidently about how the Big Bang proves the existence of God. But I'm afraid it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, it's important to say the other three arguments we went through, the other scientific argument about the law of thermodynamics and the two philosophical arguments, are entirely sound. In fact, I place most of my confidence in the philosophical arguments rather than the scientific ones. But those die-hard listeners, the Lord bless them, who want to dive into the science a bit more, should hang around for another 5 or 10 minutes. And as a reward, I want to play you at the end an amazing piece of music from Haydn's Creation at the end.
And no doubt that prospect will keep our spirits up. Jim, at the start of our conversation about the Big Bang model, you quoted the physicist Paul Davies. He said most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but also of space-time itself. That was the view of scientists in the early 1980s. But then things got a little more complicated. How did the story of cosmology go after the 80s?
I think it's helpful when we think of the story of the scientific community's exploration of the origin of the universe. I think it's helpful to divide it into 3 phases. So in phase 1, which was really from the 1920s to the 1980s, this so-called standard Big Bang theory was accepted, and we've talked about that, okay? Then in phase 2, which ran from 1980 to about 2003, the multiverse theory entered mainstream logic. And in phase 3, from roughly 2004 to today, the field of quantum mechanics took center stage in the modelling of the universe's origin. So let's pick up the story in phase 2. Although the standard Big Bang model had a great deal of evidential support, there were a few observable anomalies which puzzled scientists. Some theoretical reasons also suggested that the standard model didn't tell the full story. For example, the relatively uniform temperature across the universe couldn't be explained because the mathematics suggested that certain regions should have been causally cut off from each other. But then in 1981, a scientist called Alan Guth proposed the idea of cosmic inflation. And this is the idea that the nascent universe passed through a series of exponential expansion in its earliest moments. So according to Guth, quantum fluctuations, these tiny little quantum fluctuations in the microscopic inflationary region, they magnified to cosmic size. I wish people could see me waving my hands here. It would make
there is a lot of gesticulation going on here. Jim is visually describing what he's saying in a very helpful way.
Anyway, according to what was I? Oh, you're talking about Guth. These quantum fluctuations in the microscopic inflationary region, they magnified to cosmic size. Okay, they produced the structures of our universe. Now, that was a remarkable fix to all the anomalies that had accreted around the standard Big Bang model. But one feature of the theory led to this really, really radical idea called the multiverse. At the heart of the inflation theory was a strange type of energy that it was almost like repulsive gravity. And people started to think, if this repulsive gravity was present in the early universe, then the Hawking-Penrose singularity could get turned on its head. So instead of inflation was no longer seen as part of the Big Bang, rather the Big Bang was seen as part of an eternal inflation driven by this force called repulsive gravity. And so it was proposed that the Big Bang was just a regional event within a larger multiverse. And so in popular language, this was described as this idea of universes were like bubbles that emerged from a quantum foam as a series of singularities. Okay? I'm gesticulating quantum foam. Okay. So the 1980s and 90s witnessed a proliferation of inflationary models that challenged the second premise of the Kalam, okay? Because they allowed for an infinite past. But those models were successfully challenged by Alan Guth. He had a couple of colleagues, Alexander Vilenkin and Arvind Borde. And in 2003, they published the so-called Borde-Guth-Vilenkin singularity theorem, which I'm going to mercifully reduce to BGV. And that proved that all the inflationary models proposed at that time must have a beginning point. So you get that. So even if there is a multiverse, even if this wildly speculative idea of quantum foam, if that exists, the multiverse itself must have a beginning. That's what this BGV theorem proved. Now, BGV became William Lane Craig's new red line. The wide acceptance of BGV within the scientific community allowed him to argue that even if the multiverse concept proved to be true, the scientific community still agreed with the second premise of the Kalam, that the universe had a beginning. But by this stage, the arguments were getting more complicated and nuanced. The BGV theorem had a caveat attached. It proved that any universe which on average is in a state of cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past. And so if you listened to Craig in the later phase of these arguments, the whole rhetorical power of the Big Bang as a creation event was diminished. There's no doubt about it. So that brings us up to phase 3. Because after 2003, 4 models were developed that successfully sidestepped the BGV principle by exploiting that caveat I mentioned. And all 4 models posited an infinite past for physical reality. Most of the new models used resources offered by so-called quantum gravity. What was happening here is that this inflationary concept is bringing together 2 previously unreconciled worlds of general relativity and quantum mechanics. So fundamentally, if you want to know why physics is such a mess, we have 2 models. We have general relativity, which handles all the really big stuff. I'm waving my left arm. And we have the world of quantum mechanics, which handles all the small stuff. And the 2 cannot be reconciled. But it was becoming clear by this stage that gravity was a quantum force. So quantum theory, either in its string theory guise, or in quantum loop form, began to take center stage in these new 4 models.
Wow. I think I'm following you, Jim, and I think the hand waving is really helping a lot. I mean, I think if our listeners were able to see that, they would probably get to grips with this a lot faster. So perhaps we release a short video alongside this episode just to help. No, but in all seriousness, no, it's fascinating. It's really helpful. I think that there's a lot here that we need to know as young Christians.
Yeah, well, look, I won't go into the detail of the 4 models. I'll spare you that. But what I will say is this, very simply, they all fail. They either fail through internal contradictions, or they themselves rely on exquisite, unexplained fine-tuning, or they transgress the second law of thermodynamics, or they require a finite past. So, I'm now at long last, Ollie, able to answer the question, does contemporary science, and by that I mean science of 2024, does contemporary science support the second premise of the Kalam? James Sinclair is a physicist who has worked closely with Craig, and he concludes his survey of the latest models by saying, yes, the field of cosmology yields good evidence that the universe began to exist. Now, one of the reasons why I ground through all that physics is to show the dangers that face the Christian apologist. From a post-2003 perspective, the use of the universe's expansion to support the Kalam has become much more complicated. Remember, I had to establish that BGV principle, and then knock down the models which can justifiably sidestep it. And that's a task which loses most audiences. As a rhetorical device, it's a far cry from the powerful simplicity of the standard Big Bang as a creation event. And opponents of the Kalam have successfully promoted this hazy, vague idea of an eternal quantum foam that allows the universe somehow to create itself. So science is a fickle friend, is what I'm trying to say here. We need to understand the motivation of many atheist scientists working in this field. And in actual fact, the last 5 minutes of me talking is leading up to this quote from a quantum cosmologist called Christopher Isham. I'm fairly certain he's a Christian, but I don't know that. And he said this: "Perhaps the best argument in favour of the thesis that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it has been greeted by some atheist physicists. At times, this has led to scientific ideas, such as continuous creation or an oscillating universe, being advanced with a tenacity which so exceeds their intrinsic worth that one can only suspect the operation of psychological forces lying very much deeper than the usual academic desire of a theorist to support his theory."
So your point is that atheist scientists are so alarmed by the idea that the universe had a beginning that they're almost desperate to construct some model, any model, that allows for an infinite past.
Exactly. I think that sums up the past 40 years. It wouldn't altogether surprise me if they come up with a fiction that survives for a few years at least, but the second law of thermodynamics still stands unmoved by all the multiverse theories. And more importantly, the two philosophical arguments are unassailable. An infinite past cannot exist in space-time, so the universe had a beginning. It follows from logic alone that the cause of the universe is an uncaused, immaterial, eternal, unimaginably powerful personal mind.
That was a heavy episode, Jim, but it's got us to this amazing conclusion, phenomenal conclusion in our case for God. Using logic alone, we've established that the cause of the universe is an uncaused, immaterial, eternal, unimaginably powerful personal mind. And that's a wonderful place to end. Next week, we're going to think about the argument from design.
Yes. Now, before we close out, Ollie, I think we need to cleanse our palates, as it were, from all the foolishness of atheist men who try to suppress the truth about creation. And I can't think of any better way to do that than to listen for a couple of minutes to a chorus from Haydn's Creation. In the work, God has just said, "Let there be light." And the choir are singing the words from Psalm 19. "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." It's one of the most exhilarating, exuberant pieces of sacred music ever written. It moves me to worship every time I hear it. And it brings honour to our Creator, who brought this amazing universe into existence. I would ask any atheist listening to me now to step back from those who use mathematics as an intellectual fig leaf to hide themselves from the truth, and instead consider the eternal Creator, who in the beginning created the heavens and the earth.